Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel, and today we're discussing buying a home in Maryland and, for lack of a better term, some of the pros and cons of what you can expect from that experience. And let's get started right now. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Living in Maryland channel, where we discuss all things living here in the great state of Maryland. So if that's the kind of information that you're looking for, then you are definitely in the right spot, and we really appreciate you being here. And if you are thinking about making a move here to Maryland, if you're considering whether purchasing a home is the right decision for you, we absolutely love helping out in any way possible. So however you feel comfortable reaching out, we would absolutely love to help anytime. Days, nights, and weekends, we've got your back when moving here to the great state of Maryland. All right, everyone, so as mentioned today, we are discussing purchasing a home here in Maryland and some of the pros and cons of what you can expect from that experience. So I've been helping buyers and sellers here in Maryland for about the last 8 years, and I've purchased a few homes myself here in the state of Maryland. So just wanted to put together a short list of some things in my experience that have been some pros and cons, so you can get an idea of what to expect from this process if that's something that you want to consider for yourself and for your family. All right, so we're first off going to start with a list of pros. And the first thing that I want to mention is that Maryland is an at-the-table state. And what that means is that essentially when you as the buyer and of course the seller sign at the closing table, ownership transfers instantaneously right there at the table. So that's kind of where the term comes from. And this is kind of cool. I've been talking with some agents down in Virginia. They actually have a 2-day roughly window of like recording and kind of almost limbo. I don't want to describe it, in a way that's inaccurate, but I know that they kind of have something like that. From where I came in California, we had the same thing. So you would sign your final package, and then you would wait 2 days for them to get the lender wire, and then for them to electronically record, and you wouldn't be closed until you have confirmation of recording. So there was kind of that window, almost that lag of taking ownership of the property. Here in Maryland, ownership transfers instantaneously once all money is collected and buyer and seller sign at the table. So it makes it kind of easy, when you come here, and if you decide to purchase a home, when you go into that office and you sign your documents, you are walking out of that closing with keys and the property's yours. So it's just kind of takes a little bit, at least in my opinion, of the guesswork and the waiting and that kind of window of recording out. Now, of course, Maryland is still going to be recording with the courthouse. We just don't wait. The title companies don't wait for that to close. So they do the recording afterwards, and it's just not required to actually transfer ownership. So that recording will happen immediately after you close as well. All right, next I want to mention is that Maryland is not an attorney state. So if you decide to purchase a home here in Maryland, we are not going to have to involve an attorney. Of course, as the buyer, the contract always gives you the right to involve an attorney if you so choose to. But if you don't feel the need to do that, it's not 100% necessary, then that's one less thing that you have to do, and one more thing you can check off your list if you decide to purchase a home here in Maryland. So what happens is when you get a contract of sale accepted between you as the buyer and the seller, we are going to involve a Maryland licensed title company to make sure that they go to the courthouse, they get everything on record to ensure that you are getting clear title at closing. And they do, all these title companies in Maryland have attorneys that are going to review documents. There's a very reasonable fee. I believe it's under $100. There's a law, so it can't be over a certain amount. So it's a very reasonable fee that the attorney can charge, and it's part of the closing cost, but you don't have to go out and hire and involve an attorney to represent you. So that's kind of how it works here in Maryland. Every state's so different. It's always interesting to me how different things can be from state to state. So in Maryland, just a heads up that you do not have to involve an attorney unless you absolutely want to. All right, next is going to be that our Maryland state purchase contract is very buyer friendly. So I just like to give buyers a heads up on this, is that you got a lot of contingencies built into the contract that make it, a fairly buyer friendly contract. So we're always going to involve inspection contingencies. There's always going to be a financing and appraisal contingency. And when I say always, unless the buyer decides for whatever reason to remove it. But these are all things that we include as standard contingencies within the contract. If you are purchasing a home that has an HOA or a condo, Maryland state law requires that the seller provides you a resale package if there is a condo or an HOA association involved in the property. And we do have a few cities and towns that have city taxes. So those are additional contingencies if there is one of those applicable. So for example, in Columbia's got a city tax slash HOA in addition to any local community HOA. So we're always going to involve what's called a Columbia addendum into the contract, and that's going to state that they've got to provide the necessary resale information from Columbia, as well as provide a clear and passing letter of compliance. And that's always built into the contract, so you always have that to reference if something pops up specifically about those things. So for condos, if you're purchasing condo, you have a 7-day review period from when you as the buyer receive a full resale package. So a full resale package is the resale disclosure, confirming exactly what the amount of the HOA is and the frequency of the HOA, as well as are there any current and pending litigations, any judgments within the HOA or condo, and if there's any violations for the specific unit with the association. So you have 7 days from when you get that. And in reality, most sellers are not ordering this package until they have a contract, because it's going to come at a fairly significant cost to the seller. So you're typically looking at $300 to $400 for this package. So usually in reality, sellers getting a contract, they're waiting a few days for things to just get going, and then they're ordering that package, and it could be anywhere from 1 to 2.5 weeks to receive it. So a lot of times that review period is not starting until you're 2 to 3 weeks into the contract. So just a heads up on that, on how that typically goes down. And then if there's an HOA, HOAs have a 5-day review period. So you always have those review periods if you are looking at a property with one of those two things. And then, as mentioned prior, here is going to be a clear title contingency. So there's always going to be something in our contract speaking to making sure that there is clear title that the buyer receives prior to going to closing. And if there's any issues with that, you have full protection within the contract to get that remediated prior to closing, or to walk away and to get your full deposit back. So, and when we say contingencies, that's essentially what that means. So if you were to go, if we're speaking specifically to an inspection contingency, if you go and inspect the property and there's something that pops up that's very important to you to get either repaired or corrected, and the seller is not willing to work with you, then you have, the full ability to walk away from that contract and to get your money back. So that's kind of when we say contingencies, those are essentially protections within the contract that you as the buyer have. Now the seller has very few. So sometimes I get asked, can the seller back out? And it's not very often. So if there's back and forth with the repairs and there's negotiation and counters and all that kind of stuff, the seller can demand that the contract be voided, and they can put it back on the market or do whatever. And then if you, as the buyer, you don't make a closing, or if you don't perform in regards to your terms and conditions in the contract, then the seller can walk away. But there's really no additional contingencies for the seller. So it really is more geared and protected towards the buyer. All right, and the last pro that I wanted to mention is for first-time Maryland home buyers. There is a small incentive that I wanted to mention called the exemption of the Maryland state transfer tax. So when you come to Maryland and purchase a home, of course, just like all states, there's going to be some level of closing costs. So in Maryland, we have what's called transfer taxes. I'm going to mention this here in a minute. Typically it comes out to 1.25% of the purchase price as far as a cost for each side meaning the buyer, one side, the seller, the second side. So as a buyer, instead of paying the full 1.25%, as a first-time Maryland home buyer, you get an exemption of 1/4%, and it comes down to 1%. So instead of paying 1.25% like the seller would pay, you get a 0.25% exemption, and essentially a credit which reduces your closing costs and saves you a few bucks. So this is something that's nice, especially if you're a first-time home buyer, and something to ensure that you take advantage of if you decide to purchase a home here in Maryland. All right, and then to mention a few cons about the purchase process here in Maryland. First off, I want to start with just overall timelines, especially specific to home inspection. So all inspections here in Maryland are going to be timelined. It's not something that's open-ended. And I mentioned this just because of my experience in purchasing a property in West Virginia and then a few homes in California prior to us coming out here about 8 years ago. So when we purchased in California, and then even when we sold one of our properties recently, it was something that kind of caught me off guard, because I was so used to how things are done in Maryland, where everything's timelined and done up front in regards to inspections. But We got basically a week and a half out from closing on a property out in California, and the buyer waited to the very last minute to do a pest inspection and ended up shaking us down for some credits and a few repairs and stuff like that. And I was like, wait, how is this happening? We're so close to the end and so close to closing. How is this happening? So states can be different in regards to this as well, but this is something to just be prepared for as a buyer. When I say everything is timelined, it's just we literally assign a number of days from the date of accepted contract by the seller. So if you have a fully accepted offer between you and a seller today, a very common time frame for inspections is 7 to 10 days, although it's fully negotiable. So if this is something that's concerning to you, maybe if you're coming from out of the area and you want to make sure that you can attend home inspections, this is something to just make sure that you bring up and that you're aware of. Because if those days come and go and inspections are not completed and repairs are not requested, then you're going to lose that right to ask for repairs and to do those inspections. So if there's 10 days in the contract, you have 10 days to do the set repairs from the accepted days of contract. So if our offer is accepted today, then you have 10 days, day one being tomorrow, to complete all inspections and to ask for any repairs. And again, you want to make sure that you stay on top of those timelines, because once that comes and goes, the contract does not give the buyer the right to do any more inspections or to ask for any repairs. So just something to keep in mind in regards to that. All right, and then the next con is going to be overall closing costs, specifically transfer taxes. So in Maryland, I totally understand, and I've heard this from a lot of people, is how expensive closing costs are. So I always tell people that it can be roughly, 4 to 4.5% of the purchase price if you just want to do a rough calculation to kind of prepare it in general and just get a rough figure of what closing costs can be. So if you're looking at, a $400,000 home, you're probably looking at closing costs being around $16,000 to $18,000. So, and again, that's a very rough number, but just something that to give you an idea of. So you'd want to, we can have a more detailed conversation about that if you want to go over an exact breakdown of that. But a lender, to be honest, is the most accurate source to get the closing costs from, because there's a lot of variables when it comes to determining that total figure. So, but specifically when it comes to closing costs, transfer taxes makes up a good portion of this. And this is, if you are finding, like where you're coming from, you're finding that Maryland is very expensive when it comes to closing costs, it's very likely because of transfer taxes. So in the state of Maryland, anytime a property is bought or sold, the government at the state and local level steps in and takes a piece of that transaction through what's called transfer taxes. Now, transfer taxes is broken down into 3 separate charges made up of state and local taxes. So we just kind of lump them together and call them transfer taxes. And you can expect, as a first-time Maryland home buyer, as mentioned, to pay 1% if you're a buyer of the purchase price. So if you're purchasing a home for $400,000, $4,000 right there is going to transfer taxes to the state and to the county that you're purchasing in. And then the seller is going to pay an additional 1.25% of the sales price. So really, on the total transaction, it's about 2.5%, but the buyer and seller traditionally split that equally. So that's kind of where that comes from. It gets a little confusing, but the best way that, and the easiest way that I've found to explain it, is that each side, the buyer and seller, they each pay 1.25%, unless the buyer is a first-time Maryland home buyer. Then you get a 0.25% exemption, which drops it from 1.25% down to 1%. So it's definitely a pricey expense when it comes to buying a home, and it does drive those closing costs up a little bit, but something to be prepared for when it comes to that. All right, and then lastly is going to be that Maryland does have a lot of older homes, and this was something that I wasn't, I knew Maryland was an older part of the country, and I should have assumed that or known that, from the beginning. When we got out here and started looking for a home of our own, I'm like, I asked my wife, like, why are all the homes that I like built in the 50s and 60s and everything like that? So, what I was used to was more of homes built in the late 90s and into the early 2000s. So depending on what part of the country you're coming from, if you're used to a lot of newer homes, or you're coming from an area with a lot of newer expansion, Maryland might be a little bit of a shock to you in regards to that. So it may narrow your search if you are someone who's looking for more newer homes. So something to just kind of keep an eye out for, given the fact that Maryland is such an older part of the country, we do have a lot of older homes. So especially in the 50s, 60s, 70s, if that's something that's not going to work for you, then you definitely want to make sure you're adding filters and kind of adding some kind of search criteria to that to ensure that you're seeing homes that are going to meet your needs in regards to age. So something to keep in mind if you're going to be looking for homes out here in the area. All right, everyone, thanks so much for watching. If you ever need anything at all, please feel free to reach out and we will see you at the next video.